You all may know her from one of the earlier episodes we recently put out, and she was such a fan favorite, I had to have her back again. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the podcast, Kathleen Doyle. Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
So good to see you.
Welcome back again.
Thank you.
Yeah. How you been?
I've been good. How are you?
Good. Yeah. Just coming off of a crazy Easter weekend, Holy Week.
I know.
Isn't that crazy?
I love it. It was good.
How was your Holy Week?
It was really good. It was a lot of, kind of friends and hanging out and all that kind of stuff. Beautiful service on this really good service on Sunday morning. So it was it felt lighter than it's felt in a couple years. Like it was really felt hopeful and fun and all that kind of stuff. So it was good. How about you?
Yeah, it was good. I spent time doing the 8-day devotional on Holy Week. It was kind of long, but it was powerful because I read it with the Tree of Life version of the Bible, which is the Messianic version. And that was fascinating to do the devotional part, but also read the scripture in more Hebrew-ish kind of, in the original context. So that was a bit of a spiritual journey. So I would say this is probably one of the more spiritual Holy Weeks.
What did you, I would love to hear, what did you get out of that? What stood out?
I think the depth of, let me turn this off here. I think the depth of the purpose of why he did what he did. I think coming to die for us as an atonement was this radical act of love, but it was also to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth in a way that we had never seen, we have never experienced. And I don't know, I just think that it took me to a deeper place in experiencing his love and intimacy. And I felt more intimacy and love than I ever have, studying or doing devotional and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that was pretty cool. It was like a deep love story. Some of it I was reading, I found myself tearing up and crying. Because I guess I hadn't read it like that before, or what he was going through at the time, even when he was take this cup from me, you could feel even him experiencing the tension and what it was like to actually be God in flesh. So he had these human emotions and, but he was still God. It's just, he was experiencing the burden of carrying the weight of being the atonement for the sin of all mankind.
Right.
I think that is just massive. And even people discovering this is the Son of God. When the Roman captain, had he said it himself, this is truly the Son of God. When he saw the veil in the temple split into two, he was like, this is truly the Son of God. So when they came to claim his body, he was like, yeah, take him, It's just seeing all these details. And they put him in a tomb that was not used before, and all these little things that you never saw. You're like, oh man, this is incredible. Or things he said in the original context, Eli, Eli, when he was saying, Father, Father, why have you forsaken me? Reading that in Hebrew, for some reason, was more impactful. Or when he wrote in on the colt, the things that the people were yelling in Hebrew was interesting, And even while I was reading that, my buddy came on to the show, Stephen Peters, and he had just came back from Jerusalem. And while he was there, before he got there, some tourists had discovered the site of the actual lost temple. They were saying where this lost temple had been, and there were some inaccuracies that people felt, and they were like, well, this is it. They just kind of settled with okay, I guess they're saying this is it. But But I guess some tourists had found an area when a rabbi was giving a tour before my buddy Stephen Peters got to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And they said, Rabbi, could this be a temple of some sort? Because it's the layout is like very intriguing. And they had already went up the mountain ahead of the rabbi. And he said, what did it look like? And this guy gave the dimensions. And he said, did it have pottery at the left corner of the temple, the building structure?
Yeah.
And he said, yes, there's broken pottery everywhere. And he said, I believe you found the lost temple. And they're like, why so? And he said, well, in the ancient times, that when you go through the temples, there's like these sections of like, acts of worship and like beyond the veil, all this kind of stuff, And so when you went through, you brought an offering to the Lord. And when you gave that offering to the Lord, it was now considered holy.
Okay.
But you can't take anything holy outside of the temple. So what they do is go outside of the temple and to the back end, and they shatter the pottery that they used to pour out as their offering.
So it can't be used again.
It can't be used again.
Oh my goodness.
And so that's why there was so much pottery,
Yeah.
So but basically he brought this 3,000-year-old pottery piece of it and gave it to me for my birthday.
He did?
Yeah. Steve, yeah.
I love that.
So I have this old little ancient piece of pottery. And so I think that coming in with like Holy Week and Maundy Thursday and all the different aspects of Holy Week that I didn't know before. Yeah. I never really celebrated Holy Week like that in that way. I just knew I guess as a young man, I just knew it's Holy Week. Yeah. But I didn't know there are certain things. I know some people talk about Lent or you only eat fish and certain things and you fast this or you fast that. Actually doing it myself was a different experience. So I think that was more eye-opening for me, So, yeah.
It's so funny because I was sharing with a friend of mine. I had a little bit of a similar experience reading through Jesus, at the Last Supper and going back to the Old Testament. Yeah. So I didn't have the Bible you had, which now I want one. Yeah. But anyway, reading.
I think you should totally get one.
I need to get one. But reading through Isaiah, because there's a lot of references, and I had a moment where it just felt like something hit me that you read over and over and over again. All of a sudden, the depth of it really hits, and that it was the day of preparation. So they prepare everything so they don't have to work. Yeah. So, this concept that Jesus is in the day of preparation, all the work has been done, and he is now prepared to enter into Sabbath, and they're heading into Passover. And if you read Isaiah 58, it just talks about what the real servant looks like. They come and they set people free. Yeah. And, there's justice and there's love and there's physical healing. Yeah. And he's done all of that. And it's all the work's been done so that we can enter into rest. Yeah. And then entering into rest was Sabbath. So after Jesus died, the reason they took him off the cross is it was Sabbath. Wow. And I never really recognized the symbolism that he's prepared everything, that the next day is Sabbath. Yep. After his crucifixion. So it's Saturday. Our day of rest. The Lord, it's all been completed. We're supposed to rest. Yeah. Then it's Passover, which is deliverance. So that's the Hebrew or the Jewish celebration that they've been delivered out of captivity. So now it's Passover, which is deliverance and celebration. Yeah. And then you end it with rest again on Sabbath. And I never noticed. Yeah. I knew that the facts, but I didn't pay attention to the detail of what that all meant. And I'm like, I didn't realize all the symbolism about the timing at a real heart level.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the power of sort of a messianic experience with your faith, is that you learn about the symbolisms of why we do what we do, why we celebrate what we celebrate, and some of it's a bit different. They don't celebrate Easter, but they celebrate Passover. And even reading in the Holy Week devotional, but reading it with the Tree of Life, you realize that the old Passover was celebrating how the angel of death passed over all the firstborn children of, the Israelites, and then also how God delivered them out of Egypt.
Yeah.
But then it was like the new Passover was about the atonement of sin, and of all mankind, so that we all have this chance to spend time in eternity with Him, or have this actual experience of eternity with Him.
Yeah.
And how eternity now lives in our heart. And so you're like, oh wow, so Passover has shifted from like, the passing over of the children, the firstborn children of Israel, to the coming out of Egypt, to now the Son of God, being the atonement for all sin. And now, it's really interesting coming to experience Passover in that way, and just all these little Rosh Hashanah and all these different little holidays and the symbolisms of the high holidays in the Jewish faith and Jewish culture. I think it's incredible. Mm-hmm. I think everybody should experience it on some level, because it really, when I read the Hebrew Bible or the Messianic Bibles, I feel like it ties together so much more. And I feel like, oh my gosh, there's so many of these aha moments. Oh, that's why he said this. When you read the original context, and I believe that's why the directors and producers of Chosen sat down with those historians. One of those historians being Rabbi Jason, who I'm still trying to get to come on the show. Rabbi Jason, please. But he is one of the historians, and he does these trips to Israel, and he does a lot of historical context trips, and I love the Chosen because they give a lot of historical context. And I feel like that's what the Messianic Bible does, is it gives a lot of historical context. Like, oh, that's why he said that. Or now it changes the tone of what he was saying when you read it in actual words. Or you read the actual names in Hebrew when they call out certain characters in the Bible. You're like, oh, that's the real name. Yeah, that's the and they even give the meaning behind certain names, like Miriam and all these different ones. You're like, oh, wow. It just makes it come alive more. You're like, okay. So, I think every Christian should experience that on some level, of just even the redemptive names of God, Adonai, Elohim, Hashem, just all the different names that they called him throughout the Bible. I think there's books called The Seven Redemptive Names of God, and it's what they use to worship, or, So David used Adonai a lot. I was like, bro, I read one book, and I was just felt like half the book was Adonai. But that's how deep in worship he was. He was just in this flow of praising, so I don't know. So it was cool. It was fun. Cool.
That's good.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about I wanted to dive into mental health a little bit some more, and what are what is the how do you deal with people who deal with depression, and then what are practical steps of spiritual, biblical practical steps that people, how could they navigate coming out of that when you feel that symptoms of depression? How are what kind of practical steps can they take to overcome that? And then sometimes is it even theirs? Because sometimes things are spiritual. I was listening to this audiobook by John Eldredge, and he was saying sometimes when you pray for people, or you're have a friend that you're going to prayer about, and they're struggling with something, you're going after, their freedom and their redemption, and all of a sudden you feel something, and you're like, oh my gosh, now I feel like I'm struggling with this heaviness or this depression. Sometimes it's not yours, but it could be the same spirit that you're battling over their life can come on to yours. What do you think about some of that? I know that's a lot.
I think as far as depression, there's a lot of different things that can look like depression. So some of it's just getting an accurate assessment of what's going on. So I think we talked about this in the last podcast, but, doing a good physical workup, blood workup, et cetera, just to rule out things that look like depression that can be really affect your mood. And it can be something like your vitamin D level being really bottomed out. B12 bottomed out is bad news. A thyroid that's not right. Blood sugar that's not right. So really getting clarity. Is this depression or is there something else going on is really important. And then if you rule that out and you decide, the body's in good condition or we're getting it up to speed, then it's being really mindful of, do these symptoms have causes? So when there's no cause, like there's really, everything else is pretty good. Nothing's kicked this off. There's not grief.
Right.
And all of a sudden there's just this huge bottoming out. Again, I still send people back to get medical workups just to make sure, even a hormone drop, like postpartum, you just see these numbers on people's blood panels that are a disaster. You know what I mean?
Right,
So they don't feel good because their body's not working right.
Yeah.
So I like to shove people toward the medical system to make sure it's comprehensive. But let's just say, again, you want to know that there are times there's just the brain is not functioning right, and psychiatric help is going to be really important at that point because the chemistry is not right, and it's not your fault. It's not a personality problem or a character flaw. It's just the chemicals aren't right. But I think a lot of people feel some level of depression, and it's not really chemically based. It's unresolved grief. It's feelings and beliefs they carry about themselves that they're pretty trapped in, and they don't know that they're trapped in those feelings. It's just normal. It's like breathing air. I've always thought this about myself. Or I've always thought this about the world and the way the world functions. And whatever it is I believe causes me to feel really small, isolated, unwanted, etc. And all of those feelings are counter to human thriving. You want to feel like you can make something happen in the world. Agency is so important. I can make something happen. Purpose. I've got a reason to be here. I've got a community. It can be small or huge, but I've got a community. I've got my people. Those kinds of things, when people are not connected, or I can be accepted with my flaws. I'm not strongly shame-based where I've got to hide who I am, or I've got to kind of walk around like with, just a heavy mindset because nobody will accept me or nobody would approve of me. All of those kinds of things need to be explored and looked at. Where did you start to believe that? How did that come up? To kind of push it against reality, sometimes challenge reality and what's true and what I think, do they actually match up? So those are some of the things that end up being pretty important to look at, because it can give a person a sense of freedom when they realize, man, I've really kind of stepped into an identity or I've stepped into a role or belief about myself and it just feels fixed. I'm on train tracks. It's the way I'm always going to live and do life. And sometimes you have to get in there and challenge that because it's not a healthy mindset. It came from an unhealthy place and people need some freedom. And sometimes you'll see a lot of symptoms lift when people change their beliefs about themselves or the world. No, I agree with that. I've had that in the past. And when I was younger, for some reason, I struggled super heavy with depression, and they were considering medicating me. It would come and go in like spells. But I think when I got around community, found purpose, man, it's a whole different person. But then when I got stuck in certain seasons too long where it just felt purposeless, I think, or you felt powerless. That's another one. It's really easy to believe something that's not true. So you really have to, like you said, like challenge certain realities and like, hey, well, what is, the heart of God? What is true? Really hearing God's voice over your
your life for yourself. What does he think of you? How does he see you? You know, is a huge, I feel like a huge breakdown. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think it's really true. I think the challenge in this world is if you take God out of the equation, there are finite resources. There's only so much power to go around, and so people get competitive and sometimes ruthless, you know, and they restrict each other, and you know, there's a reason. There's so much conversation in Scripture about setting captives free. It's just, you know, it's so important to acknowledge captivity is part of this world, is getting stuck, whether it's because somebody's done something to physically restrain you, or they've just stripped out all your opportunities and all the things that would allow you to feel like you're using your gifts and you're alive and you're, you know, God's a creator, like you're creating. And there are people who are like, I don't want you to create because if yours is better than mine, I lose.
Yeah.
And so,
that's true.
So sometimes it's recognizing when you've kind of been hit by a lot of, you know, we live in California, right? So we have, you know, sets of waves. So a wave comes in sets, right? Yeah. And if you get hit by one after the next, after the next, eventually you're done. Yeah. You know, you're drowning. You feel
defeated.
You're just exhausted, or your head's going to go under the water. You're going to be in trouble. And so I think that's a strategy of the enemy. I'll just keep coming at you until you're down. And once you're down, it's easy to stay down. Yeah. It's so easy to stay down. And you're not being dramatic. You really did get knocked down. You really did have things taken away from you. You really did have opportunities stripped away. So it's hard to convince a mind or a brain that won't happen again. Keep going. The brain's like, no, I already experienced that. I know it's real. Yeah. And getting someone off the ground after a real loss or a real like oppression or a real restriction and just trying to find hope and go, remember life before that? You know what I mean? Right, or look at someone else, like find some courage on their story. They got out of this. Take a look at them. Yeah. Finding that hope again is hard because I do think the brain is wired to avoid pain, you know? Yeah. So it's like, well...
Fight or flight. Fight or flight, sorry.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I saw an MMA fighter training for the biggest fight of his career recently, and I found it fascinating watching his training camp because he had another guy. There was like stuff in the gym where they were doing with like technique and, you know, all that stuff, the typical stuff you see a fighter would work on. But then like they sent him over to this other guy who, it's like a psychologist in the pool, swimming pool. And he had like him go dive down at the deep end of the swimming pool with weights. Yeah. And then you have to like bring the weights back up and, or you have to stay down. He kept getting him to stay down a little bit longer and longer each time. Yeah. And he said the reason why he did that because he wanted to challenge his fight or flight response. And he wanted to trigger it and also get him to think creatively under pressure. Right. And I noticed in the fight, I watched a clip of the fight this past weekend, and I saw him. He actually beat the guy who beat him 3 times, and this is the 4th time they were fighting. And so he actually he was under pressure in the fight, and I was wondering, like, is this training going to kick in? And the guy had him against the fence, and he was starting to look like the last fight they had just had where he knocks him out against the fence. Yep. So he's against the fence, and he was hitting him, and then all of a sudden he comes out with a left and then a right, and he just like knocks the guy out. And that was it. You know, the fight was over, and everyone's like, wow, he comes back and claims his title. And I thought, that's interesting that you could train yourself to like run in a battle under pressure, or you could like choose to like, you could train yourself to fight back. So I thought that was really interesting how like there is something to be said. There's like a science to the fight or flight, you know, mechanism within you. You know, totally. In the first fight, he just kind of, in a sense, you know, let go and just fell into the moment. But this time he refused to, and actually fought his way out of it. You know, and I thought the training that he undergo, I felt like that. So, anyways, yeah.
I think that, you know, it's interesting because that avoidance of pain in some ways can help keep us alive, right? Like, I don't want to walk out here and get hit by a car, so I'm going to like not walk in front of a car. Smart stuff like that. But if it takes over, I lose grit, and in the Bible, perseverance is important to our spiritual development, is that place to keep going. And how many times are we called to be courageous and to keep pushing past? And so that guy I can't, even hearing the story of him in those weights and being pushed.
I was like, you have to stay underneath water for a certain amount of time, and you're starting to panic, and you're like, I'm sure it took him several times to finally stay under there, but with the weights, but I just thought, wow, jeez.
To mentally overcome it.
Yeah.
And you just even think about like Paul, to keep going. In the Bible, Paul, all those beatings, all knowing it's not going to be good in this city. I do think part of working through non-biological depressive feelings is hope, for sure, but it's perseverance. And the temptation, I think right now in this generation, and I think it's all bad. I think this generation recognizes some abusive things that should stop if we want to be a society that comes together and works together.
Yeah.
So I don't think that the argument is all bad.
Yeah.
But the idea that we can make you safe and that's what's going to make you happy, or that's what's going to heal anxiety and depression, isn't realistic. There is a fight in us. There is something, I think, that God put in us that needs a challenge, has to overcome, needs to persevere, needs to develop the muscles, needs to take on a challenge. And if we don't do that, something atrophies in us. It's like weightlifting, you know what I mean? And so even to your point, if pushing past what I think my limits are and continuing to go, I think that's where community becomes important, is who we surround. Because you can have people in your life who keep you down. And then you can have people who help push you forward.
Yeah.
And having that sense of like agency and control, and I don't know, I think it's important, even in terms of being made in God's nature, is finding ways to push forward. But a lot of times you have to get some real chains of, thinking off of you in order to be able to do that and challenge things and mindsets that can keep you down when it's not. You really can do it, but it's in your head that you can't, or whatever. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you say to people who have, I don't know, like myself, been a community guy, and it's like, oh my gosh, I love people. Like when I used to tour, I would always keep the context of the people that, I stayed with or connected with, and stay friends throughout the years. And because I just love people, but then you find yourself in this crazy season where you're like, you're trying to hold on to friendships that are just like, no, this is like, well, how do you overcome that? Because
my word.
I think I might have spent too much time. I'm not a person who gives up very easy. Even if it hurts, I don't give up on people or things. Like I've just always learned to be a fighter for things, fight for things that are right, that are just, that are pure, that are holy, that kind of stuff. But lately I've started to question and even talk with the Lord, have conversations with God about like, do I need to like back away? Because it starts to feel like you're chasing community and friendships that don't want you. Yeah. And so what do you suggest for situations like that where you're kind of starting to look like you're doing all the chasing and pursuing? Yeah. But there's nothing back on the other end.
Yeah. I mean, I think if we went like deep. Yeah. And if you were to find it's a pattern. One of the things that can happen is we learn to play a role instead of being like a whole comprehensive person. I need some things from people. I'm going to give some things to people. If there's we all have brokenness, right? So I'm going to be super generic.
Yeah.
Like, let's just say someone in the background, let's say it was a trauma, there's some trauma in the background, and everyone in the household's just coping, right? Everyone's just coping.
Yeah.
We're surviving. I need you to do this, 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 and this. And everyone ends up kind of wearing a hat. I'm the funny one. I'm the one that brings relief. I'm the one that's going to, blow off steam and express all the anger that nobody's expressing. So that role kind of can get fixed. And if the role were to be something like, hey, I'm here to keep everyone together. I'm here to make the family happen. I'm here to make community happen. And you learn that trait in an environment where everybody else is stressed and distracted. They can't reciprocate what you're bringing. Does that make sense?
Right.
What can happen is you go into the world and you find people who are stressed and distracted, and you're like, those are my people. I'm going to make this community work. You know what I mean? And they don't have the bandwidth to be present or to reciprocate or to make community happen. So sometimes if you notice a pattern of certain kinds of dynamics, it's important to go inside and go, man, what am I like when I show up in certain environments? I remember I had an experience. I was in my 20s, and I realized that I would walk into certain environments and I'd find someone who wasn't engaged in the party and wasn't really participating and might even be a little grumpy. And I'd work really hard to draw them out. And I'd make them laugh, and you know what I mean?
I'm sure you did.
Warm them up and, all that kind of stuff. And I would be so proud of myself. And later on, I realized, I've got a lot of friends that are grumpy and don't like to socialize. I'm like, how did I end up doing it? And, and I had to go back and go, what is it in me that I'm trying to do? What do I feel guilty, obligated? What's happening inside me that I'm drawing this? And then when I need something, they don't have the capacity to return friendship.
At all.
It's one direction, and I'm tired. And when something goes wrong in my life, I'm looking around going, I have a lot to draw off of. So, and they want me back around when I feel better. They're kind of like, I don't want to hear from you.
When you're the joy bringer.
Yeah, when you're in a good mood again.
I need you to make me laugh. You're like, oh, okay.
So it's recognizing have I come to step into an identity or a role that I didn't realize. It's not like I thought about it. And I'm watching the fruit of that show up in my life all the time. So sometimes it's paying attention to patterns. But if spiritually, another thing that I think that can come up is there are times I do think, even supernaturally, a lot of doors shut, not because you've done anything wrong, not because there's dysfunction, but I usually think about Hosea chapter 2, where the Lord says, I called you out into the desert to speak tenderly to you there. And sometimes I do think there's a circling of the wagons around certain people at certain times to draw them into the desert where you hear what's going on inside of you. And you experience the presence of the Father in a way that you can't, it's hard to when you're busy. You're not there forever, but there are times I think it's time to do a little bit of housekeeping.
Some soul
searching.
Some healing.
Exactly.
Inner healing.
And sometimes our relationships, as important as they are, we need a little space to hear because we can attend to people or expect them to attend to us. That's a lot of energy. And sometimes that all kind of gets quieted down for a while so that you're distraction free. And it's really you and the Father kind of doing business.
I've sensed that too. I really felt like I had some conversations with my wife about that because we were like, what is going on? There's a point recently where I just was knocking on doors, and I even had people tell me straight, I was like, man, I'm sorry, I just don't have time for you in my life right now. And I was like, oh, right. I respect it on one end because they were just like, didn't waste my time. Some people are scared to say that, so they just dodge you. And I respect it on one hand. On the other hand, it really kind of hurt. I was like, oh man, that sucks. But me and my wife were talking sometimes God will do that to isolate you a bit, so it's just you and Him. And we're like, yeah, that's so true. So what you're saying, I do believe that because I feel like the Lord's been speaking to me on a much deeper level and bringing me back to just me and Him and music. Music's always been something special for me. I've never been able to like really pursue it full time. It's been something I'll do on the side when I have time, a little extra time in between whatever it is I'm doing. And so, but lately it's been bringing it back to these heart songs of him. And sometimes I would just do a chord progression and then sit there and cry, just pray with the Lord and feel his presence over me, you know. So yeah, I think that there's a time where the Lord takes you through that desert, like you said, and speaks to you. Because we can also put a lot of emphasis on hearing God's voice through our friendships, I believe, you know, where you almost rely on, because it's accessible. It's hard for some people to go, you know, have this relationship with something that's invisible. Like this, you know, God is invisible, you know, even though he can show up in the form of angels and all these different things, or a donkey starts talking, the voice of God coming out of it. He can do all that. A lot of times for people, God feels invisible. Yeah. And so when you have God speaking through somebody across the table from you, it's a little bit more comforting. Like, oh gosh, I just appreciate you just always hear from the Lord. You just know what to say. But sometimes God's like, you're relying a little too much on that. Like, I want you to talk directly to me, you know? And so I want to talk directly to you, like have this intimacy moments, you know? Yeah. And I think that's hard because you're like so used to the chaos, you know, the surrounding of this and that, you know, and being distracted with those things. Some of them are good distractions, but I don't know. I think sometimes we rely a little too much on other things or friends or whatever it might be. Yeah. You know.
And I think sometimes in that quiet, stuff bubbles up.
Yeah.
You know, anger bubbles up or hurt bubbles up. Just stuff that you're grown up. You could go through life without stuff and not have it ruin your life and not really, you know, it's not affecting everything you do all the time. Yeah. But sometimes in that, it's funny. I was talking to someone about this, but sometimes I notice with clients I work with who are really, you could tell when they were kids, they were good little boys and good little girls. Like you could tell, they just did it right and everything. And so they're trying to kind of, you know, in a way they can lose part of themselves because they really don't want to hurt anybody. They want to please people. They want everything harmonious. And so they're working hard. But sometimes part of who they are, their gifts or call, kind of gets squashed and buried in trying to attend to everybody else. Yeah. And I can't tell you how many times I've watched the Lord like kind of just frustrate the heck out of like just not mean-spirited, but just say no to a lot of things they're trying to pursue. And finally something comes out of their mouth that's them. It's them. It's the real person. Yeah. And I can't tell you how many times I've just thought, I go, that's who God wanted to talk to. Yeah. You know, that person right there that you feel, you don't want to be mad and you don't want to, you know, you want to be obedient, you want to do all the right things, but there is some longing inside of you or some hurt inside of you. And you've been trying so hard to not have it. I don't want to feel that hurt. I don't want that longing or whatever, but it's still in there. And there's just times where I watch it just finally come out and I'm like, oh, I think we just had a breakthrough. Yeah. You know what I mean? I think something good just happened.
We have tapped into gold, ladies and gentlemen. Let's give God a hand praise.
And, I love it. And I think sometimes we can lose touch of how much he knows us personally. And the genuine real you is the person he wants to relate to. Yeah. Not the put together or the performer or the successful or the powerful or whatever. Just who's the real you? And that's the guy I see, that's the guy I know. And I want more of that. And this world, it doesn't invite that. Like, this is not safe.
Yeah. People want something that makes them feel good, or it's hard to, you know, be yourself sometimes. I think I guess in the world they celebrate it to a degree. Like they celebrate depression and stuff. So you see that kind of with Gen Z through all these songs about like glorifying being depressed and on Xanax and all, you know, all of this stuff that's crazy unhealthy, you know, but it's a reality, you know, and so, and I think that's why some artists in the church always feel like, oh man, I just want to do something more mainstream because I can just truly be myself, and then people will celebrate me for it. It's a little different in church. You kind of have to have it.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of this unspoken pressure that you have to have it together.
Yeah.
Because the moment that you show that you're just like vulnerable and you're not fully like the joy bringer or like the super, man of God or woman filled with zeal on that Sunday morning service or something, maybe you're just kind of barely dragging yourself in there. People are like, oh my gosh, they're in an unhealthy place.
Yeah.
So you get labeled unhealthy and like you need to take time off and go heal and do stuff, and then come back.
Yeah.
And you can serve so it's kind of tough when a lot of church and ministry have almost labeled that. Like I've had somebody, people used to always come up to you and be like, how are you doing? You're like, oh, you kind of give like a general answer and they're like, no, how are you really doing? Like, oh, you mean like, they're like, how are you really doing? You're like, oh, you really want to know? I told this lady, I said, you really want to know? She's like, yeah, I don't want just the Christianese answer. And I was like, oh. And I started to just briefly touch the skin of like, not even fully of what I was going through at the time.
Yeah.
And, before I could even I was like surface deep. Yeah. And then before I can like even go any deeper, like she just cuts me off. She's like, oh God, just bless his heart. Break off all that junk and that mucus of the enemy and that slime. We just break that off in Jesus' name. God bless you. God. She walks off and I was like,
oh, no. Oh my God.
And I kind of like, wow. And I knew in my spirit, I was like, there could be certain like ministries that are like all about joy and anointing and the buckets of heaven and all this stuff, like drink from the well. But then like as soon as you have a real moment, you're like, 8 people close to me have died recently and I'm trying to figure out how to get past that. They're like, oh, okay, you go over there,
right?
Like, nobody suddenly wants to deal with you.
Right.
And then they all disappear. And so you're like, whoa, like that's a strange reality. So I noticed that.
Yeah. I think that's a little unique to the evangelical culture in church because I didn't grow up with faith or anything like that, but some of my relatives were Catholic and Irish Catholic.
Oh, there you go.
And
Charlie got fathers.
Exactly.
Sorry, that was really bad.
Lucky Charms. And they did grief pretty well. Like they moved towards stuff. And I noticed in evangelical culture, like when I got involved in everything, everyone shows up to the baby shower and the wedding and the celebration, blah blah. But unless they're older, like unless people are older. There was a weird absence when people struggled and suffered. Yeah. It just was quiet. Yeah. And I think people care. I'm not questioning the care, but like the coaching of how do you show up for people in these really tough moments, I don't think people know what to do. So they're just like, kind of like, make it go away, get rid of it.
Or like in charismatic cultures, I think the emphasis is on joy. So anything which you need joy. Like John Eldridge talks about that, how like when there's an abundance of joy, depression cannot survive. It's like when you fill your temple with joy, you fill your spirit, your heart with joy. Yeah. There's not a lot of room for the enemy to like take you down on certain angles through depression or something like that because you're just filled with like an abundance of joy. But I noticed that in charismatic culture, we put so much of emphasis on joy that we don't really have much language for when a person's just having a hard time. Yeah. Unless it's somebody like really highly respected in the faith, and then we have a little more grace for like, oh, so-and-so's having a hard time. Like, let's all pray for him. Yeah. But it's a little bit different, I noticed, in a charismatic culture where I think the emphasis is on joy and just being filled with the Spirit, that you should deal with that before you come to church, and then you could be a joy bringer amongst us and spread the joy around. Yeah. And so I think that was kind of like this emphasis, and that always I always looked at that and observed that in the watch, and I was like, wow, that's really interesting. It wasn't until I found pockets of community that said, Kelly, we want you to come over for dinner on a Wednesday night or a Thursday night or a Monday night. and with the family, and this is like time for us to be ourselves.
Yeah.
Like one family, I had 3 families that I would connect with, and I remember one family, and I showed up, they were like, they told me over the phone, like, this is a safe space for you. When you come to do dinner with us, it's safe space.
Yeah.
And then I showed up to the door. I was like, hey guys, how's it going? You know, they're like, go great, so good to see you. And they're like, just one moment before they let me in the house, they looked at me and were like, Kelly, we want you to know that this is a safe place for you. And we want you to strip your armor off and leave it at the door. Leave it at the door.
Wow.
And we want you to be vulnerable, raw.
So good.
If you need to scream, scream. If you need to yell, yell. If you need to curse, curse. You know, that was just kind of the thing they said. They were like, just
be yourself.
Be yourself. Yep. That's all we ask. And I was like, oh my gosh. And it kind of shocked me because I'm standing in the doorway and they're like looking at me with a serious look. And I was like, okay. And so I got in there and it was just like, wow, it felt like home every time. There was like this huge, giant, smelly dog who would come around. He just stunk, but he was so sweet. He was like one of those bear dogs. And so you're like rubbing him as you're like talking honestly. But it was like over time, it became this place of like therapy. And I realized maybe I'll stick to these pockets of community where they're giving me permission to be safe. And then when I show up to church, of course I was a lot more healthy. I was naturally a joyous person. Yeah. I love to make people laugh. And that's how I became an actor and got into that because, you know, I did YouTube sketches and got signed by agencies in LA. And so, it just kind of like naturally that's going to be me. But what happens when, the clown has a moment of sadness. You know, I've always been a class clown. You know, that was my downfall in school, and all the teachers labeled me class clown because I got good enough to make them laugh. Mm-hmm. And so I knew, like, oh my gosh, my teacher's laughing at my jokes. Like, I'm in. You know, I'm good. But it was only to distract away from something that I had a learning disability, and I was labeled mentally challenged. And so there was always that underneath thing that I never fully dealt with. And so when I got into more charismatic settings and ministries, there was an emphasis on joy, which is incredible. But I found when I needed to deal with the depression or the darkness that I was feeling inside, maybe it was a mindset I was battling at the time, whatever it was. I don't remember everything, but whatever it was I was struggling with at the time, I couldn't really be my full self. And so I just only brought my joyous self until it was safe for me to bring my full self in certain settings.
And that makes sense. Like to be compartmentalized where I can only be that one part of myself. I can only be known as this one thing, funny or whatever, gregarious or whatever, and nothing else. That'll be rejected, or that will leave me too vulnerable. I just think being compartmentalized like that it's exhausting.
It is,
because there's always a little part of you. And even going back to the joyful at church, you know, we all know everybody fights on the drive out there. You know what I mean? That it's that whole person, you know, relating with wisdom, right? Not everybody's safe to be around, blah blah blah. But like it's that whole person that you rest in your own skin, and you're not always feeling like, man, I got to be on, and I've got to make sure that if I talk about this stuff, people like, you know, be uncomfortable or try to shoo it away, or so I got to manage how I show up, and it's super tiring. And for you to have places make sense where it's like I can just really tap into the parts of myself I usually have to hide, and talk about the fact that I'm sad or I'm hurt or I'm mad or whatever, and it's okay. It makes sense. That felt really healing. Yeah,
well, I mean, I was actually told that once by a leader. It was like, hey, you need to learn to compartmentalize, because I was on the stage, and so it was a really prophetic setting. Yeah. And like they were like, I can feel what you're going through, and it's distracting. Yeah. And I was like, oh, I am so sorry. Like I didn't say anything, but they just felt it. And so they're like, you need to learn to compartmentalize before you come on stage and all that. And you're like, oh, got it. So I learned to like have to shut certain things out. And later on in life, I was like, man, I don't know if that was exactly wisdom. Like, I don't know, because then it makes you you know, like you said, exhausted, like you're working to try to hide certain things and you're scared, like if I come out and say this, then I'll, you know, they won't think I'm healthy, or like, oh, they don't want me to serve anymore, you know. So I'm wondering as a church how we can get past it. I think there's a lot of churches that are more mature nowadays, especially with what we just went through with like shutdowns and all that stuff we just kind of gone through. I think people have learned like to have more empathy and sympathy for like people who've like struggled with like mental stuff or like spiritual things, or, you know. So I think there are a little bit more churches that are more compassionate towards people, but there's still a lot out there that, you know, you have this sense, you know, when I had some friends share that with me, they felt like they needed to be a certain way to come to church. I was like, oh, that's a bummer. Like, because they stopped coming for a little bit, and I was kind of like, why'd you stop showing up? And they're like, I don't know, man. I just felt like I kind of need to be a certain way. And I think they were just struggling at the time, and they just probably needed permission to be like, it's okay. Show up as you are, and like, let God wash over you. Like, let God wash over your sin or whatever that pain is, and just let him heal you. And I'm here for you. I think sometimes it just takes saying, I'm here for you. You know, like, I love that about Messiah Yeshua. You know, he, instead of judging this woman who was a prostitute, you know, he just loved her where she was at. There's something powerful about that. If he did it, like, we need to do that, you know, because I think that's a lot more effective than just saying, well, you need to go through our 12-step discipleship program first, which is totally fine. You know, people do need to be discipled, but it's not like faith through, you know, or healing through works. You have to do all this work to be healed. Like sometimes it's good to just be loved where you're at, and then that compels you to rise up into wanting to be better and do better. And so I don't know. It's just a thought.
And I think going back to the being on stage, right, and being told, hey, compartmentalize that. And I think there's an expectation, and I think a lot of people contribute to it. It can be the congregation, it can be, you know, the lead pastor, it can be, you know, whatever, entertainment, you know, but certain things look a certain way, feel a certain way all the time, and there's no missteps, and there's no, you know, it looks polished and put together and all that. And I think I'm hearing these conversations. I think some of it came out a little bit from the Asbury stuff, but just like, what does it look like rather than sitting in a green room, you know, where everybody chats and then does this prayer ministry, you know, does a quick prayer and then heads out. You know, what does it look like to really create space somewhere? It doesn't have to be Sunday morning, but to be real and to be honest. And I think even, you know, having worked on church staffs, it's always been important to me, like, this has to be a place where we have to be healthy enough, but like real. There's got to be a place to be able to be real. And I think that trickles down, you know, and I think if you believe that it's important that a person be whole and real, and you create space for it, and you let yourself be that, I think you start seeing people feel greater and greater permission. But if you set the tone of, hey, we're put together, we're polished, we don't show, you know, any chinks in the armor, and we, you know, then all of a sudden you've got, and we don't have space for you, just come and perform for us, you know, but there's no other space for you. I think that stuff, you know, it trickles down. And I think, like, going back to what you said with what happened with the shutdown, people don't have room for it. I don't think people have room for it anymore. I think there's a real opportunity right now.
There is.
To be really genuine.
100%.
Because there's no, everybody fell on their face, you know,
my gosh.
And there was no answers, and we didn't know what we were doing. And I think, you know, I think there's a place where the Lord could be slowly working in people to reshift how the culture we've created, you know, and what we've done with what he gave us. It's supposed to be a gathering and a fellowship and a place to build one another up and use our spiritual gifts. And, you know, I don't have enough perspective and distance to have clarity, but I'm not sure we're doing it all the way it's supposed to be done. And because of that, our relationships aren't as rich as they could be. And when they're not rich and they're not very deep and they don't have a lot of substance, it does, going back to the original question, it affects mental health. Like,
yeah.
So I think even a healthier way of approaching relationship in the church could impact people's mental health of just feeling accepted. Yeah,
100%. I recently saw a friend who moved from LA during the whole California exodus. And I saw her post on social media, and I just was so proud of her. I remember when she had wrote me one time, said, I really feel like I need to leave LA. Like, I feel like God's saying it's time to go.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, another one, feeling led to leave. And so, you just bless her and pray for her. But when I saw her recently and the richness of her life and the intentional community upon community was like, it was incredible. I just wrote her a post. I was like, I am so proud of you for hearing the voice of God. And I really, that's the one thing I miss is like richness, where it's like that Book of Acts. I believe they knew one another.
Yeah.
Book of Acts. I believe they knew each other's names and like family members, because when it's like a smaller community like that, there's so much power in knowing someone more than just their name, but like, what makes them move and, what makes them excited, full of joy, or what their needs are. There's something powerful and intimate about it. Even if you don't have the means to help, you just help through prayer and support. There's just something really powerful about that. And so, when you have that effect, it actually, in my opinion, it affects the spiritual journey too. When I look back on the early days of being at my old church, Bethel, and being at BSSM, there was really nothing to do there in that small podunk town called Redding, but it forced us to be intentional. Yeah. Because LA has like concert venues and it's like museums upon museums, and like, what kind of museum you want to go? You want to go to visual arts? You want to be immersive? We have it. There's so many cool things to do. Yeah. But it's also distracting. And it's also like community's done in LA a lot by location. Yeah. If you're more in the valley, Thousand Oaks, then like we can hang. Yeah. But if you're way out here, I don't know, Orange County, whatever, chance is going to be pretty slim. I can't go too deep with that, bro. You a little too far away. I don't do no phone ministry. So it's kind of like there's not a sense of like deepness, I think, and that's kind of what I miss. And I see from people when they move out of California, or one guy moved to South Carolina, just that, again, you can see that richness. And then they explain to you, like, hey, what's going on? What's going on? They start explaining, God's just doing community out here in the sticks. It's kind of weird, and so another friend is out in Santa Maria, and there's this small little community, and I wrote the pastor and I wrote the associate pastor. I was like, you guys, this is incredible. Like, they're going after art and like music together, like painting, sculpting. Yeah. I was like, I never seen the church do that, and they just do it like on a Saturday. It's like they call it their creative flow day, where they worship God through their perspective. There's people journaling. There's like writers in the back at tables. So great. And it's incredible. That wouldn't have happened if it wasn't intentional. Yeah. I noticed the pastor was doing a project where they were stripping out some school bus and turning it into something. I don't know what they're turning it into, but they did it together. They were stripping the bus down together. Right. Or they bought cattle, and now they're learning how to farm together. Yeah. I was like, this is incredible. And you learn so much, and you learn to care on the whole deeper level. So I hope to see that come back to parts of the body of Christ. And I know that there's some.
And I think, to your point, in large city areas, I think it's so much harder.
It is.
In a large city. And I think you could describe it for a lot of different reasons, but I think you're making a really good point that there are places it happens, but where you have a lot of turnover, people come and go a lot.
It's transient.
A lot of people transplanted. Yeah. I remember we moved from Ohio. We knew all of our neighbors. Yeah. And it was called the Doyle House for like 10 years after we moved out. Like, it was still the Doyle House. Yeah. We moved to California, and we had a neighbor we lived next door to. One I babysat for, so we knew them very well. Yeah. But one we lived next door to came and left after, 12 years. I don't know their name.
Wow.
And it was a house. Like, it wasn't, there, multiple people on the street. I did not know their name. I didn't know who they were. It was just very California is very different in that way. And I think it looks more like big cities.
Yes.
In that you can, and yet that's where most of the population is, is in big, most of us are living in big cities. In a big city.
Yeah.
And we're not doing community like you can get it in Santa Maria or somewhere in North Carolina.
Yeah.
They're thriving. And
they're thriving because that's all they have. I think there's something to be said. Man, I just miss that. And so I'm wondering if there's a way we can bring that to. I experienced it a little bit when I first moved to LA, and I was a part of E58, and we did a lot together, the worship community as well. And when there was people who were like, there were so many people who moved down, like, I moved here on faith, and you're like, oh, we all have. But they were like, I don't know how I'm gonna pay my bill, or I don't know how I'm gonna get groceries. I've been broke for the past 3 or 4 days, or whatever. You're like, oh my gosh. And so we would do this thing where we all come together. It's like, everybody reach in your pockets, and you just pull out all this money, and it's cool. It was so awesome. Right. It was amazing.
Yep.
Because people hadn't eaten for 4 or 5 days. Yeah. And then all of a sudden they had this money, that plenty of groceries for the next 2 or 3 weeks, Yeah. Or I don't know, people needed a car or something, and they're like, hey, I can give rides for this many times, Yeah. And I just thought that was so cool to see. And so I know that it can be done. I just pray that there's a heart that can enter into the big city churches of let's be intentional. Yeah. I think it just takes intentionality.
And I think you're right. And I think I'm trying to think why we do it, but I do think when you come to a city, a lot of time you have an individual dream.
Everybody's
right, it's a big career move, or I got the job, or whatever. And I think getting people to say, I want more than just my own individual, because what you can find is someone is like, I'll take all you have. Yeah. So then community starts developing around one person who takes and other people who support, as opposed to things that are more reciprocal. And I think, there's probably something in city living that might have someone smarter than me would need to, need to kind of describe. But I do wonder, because if you're settled in a smaller town, which is where I grew up originally, right, people are ambitious, but you value your town too. And there are problems. Drugs hit our town. It's not idyllic. There's problems with it too. But I think there's a mindset when you move to a city of, I'm here for me and mine. And
trying to level. Everybody's here to level up, especially when, they call Los Angeles a city of dreams. Yeah. Everybody's coming here to level up to some degree. And so I think you're right. It's even driving here, I notice driving is insane. Everybody's trying to cut each other off. That's why there's so many accidents, because nobody wants to be last. They want to be first. And so even though you're here's the merging, you're oh, let's work with each other. I know you probably got to get over to this one. No! And they go around you. And you're bro, I was going to let you in, but you just cut me off. It's I have to be first. There's that whole go-getter mentality here, I think, where it's my dreams, everything comes first. I have to get here first, and I hope that changes. I pray for that transformation. I really do believe it's going to come. I do, because, look at the Jesus movement that was birthed out of here. That was all community, man. Yeah. Folks was just hanging out at coffee shops and singing songs and, being in each other's life, going to the beach together. Even in at the same time, there was this whole fitness movement happening with Venice, with Arnold Schwarzenegger and all these guys. And I was looking at that video, Pumping Iron, and they did everything together. Yeah. They pumped iron in the morning together. They showered together, which was weird. They showered together. Pause. Love you, Arnold Schwarzenegger. I seen you the other day in Santa Monica. I love you, but that was weird. They showered together, and then they left and did dollar omelets in Venice at some shop together. And then they went out and worked out again together. And then they went to go get something to eat again. And then they went and laid out on the beach to tan together and then went back. It was like everything was like a group of them.
Yeah.
And they caught it on video. And you're like, everything was in a group.
I love it.
And so part of the reason why it became such a big movement was because everybody was like in each other's lives. And there's so many of these guys still floating around out there. They're older now, but they're like, oh, I remember Arnold, and we used to do this. And one time he gave me the best advice in the world, and then my calves just grew. And, it's like, and they have these weird little stories, but it wouldn't have happened if like they weren't all into this move together. And so I translate that to like, even Christian faith is like when we're intentional in each other's lives. I look at the Jesus movement, which they just made a powerful movie on, and it's just so much community upon community, and it was just like around songs and gathering and worship, and even when I look at the tapes of my aunt, she's the original singer and co-writer of "Oh Happy Day." Shout out to Dorothy Morrison. When I look at the old videos of when she toured and were at all the Woodstock festivals, or she did the Big Sur Festival with Joanne Baez. Joanne Baez loved her, so she called her out to the big festival where all these other artists were playing in San Francisco or outside of it. And my aunt showed up with my whole family, the Combs family, and they were gospel singers. And so there's this big hit on the radio at the time called "Oh Happy Day." And they're like singing at this festival where people are dropping acid, like even as they span out to the crowd, people are like, like you're like, what is going on? That guy.
Oh no!
I mean, this guy with like a brown jug. It was like I don't know if it was moonshine or even so. They're like joints and alcohol and acid, and they're all just like groovy, man. And out in the crowd, and then all of a sudden, like my aunt starts singing this song. She starts getting into the chorus, and the Holy Spirit starts showing up.
Oh my word.
And the power of God starts hitting where people start dropping their joints and their jugs, and then they run over to the swimming pool and they're shouting, "Oh happy day, oh happy day," and she's saying, "When I get to heaven," she's like, "Ain't gonna be no crying," she's singing, she's going off in these choruses.
Word.
And people start catching the Spirit of God. They start baptizing themselves and jumping in the pool, and just like, it was just crazy. And so I look at that. That was right around the same time as the Jesus movement, where all that was happening. All that was possible because society went from even Times Magazine wrote, "Is God dead?" Because it went from the sexual revolution to now the Jesus revolution, and it was like all these hippies were about love and Jesus is love, and Lonnie Frisbee was tearing up the streets, and out from Orange County, Costa Mesa, all the way out to LA, and it's just like, it's just incredible. So I just hope to see that again, and
to your point, like when it was a sexual and the drug revolution, right? Like it was. You could do anything you wanted. And it was so empty. Right? And we're there again. You can do anything you want.
Yes, true.
You can do anything you want. Are you happy?
Be anybody you want.
Be anything. Be anything you want. Do anything you want. And I think, but then you read, humongous rise in depression, suicidality, anxiety. Clearly, there's something else. And I do wonder, it does seem like those are the times the Lord shows up and just like, you've turned over every rock trying to find something other than me. And so it'll be interesting to see.
It is, man. I saw some folks the other day. I was scrolling through my feed, and there was like young people saying, I identify with a robin or like a cat. And I was like, you can just be an animal now? And that's when you hit the low of society, when you start to really, or people identify as babies. I didn't know that's a new thing, and they actually are stuck in the state of a baby. And you're like, whoa, this is intense. But it's always at the darkest hour when God steps in, and he's just like, I'm here to be your redeemer. I can redeem all that. And so
bring you up to the highest dignity of who you are. If we're made in God's image, right, we're not him, but we're made in his image. There's a dignity. If you look at who he is and what he does, and he's like, I've made you like me. You're not me, but you're like me. I want you to look like this. And creator, and healer and love and power and justice and goodness. Like he's like, that's when you're at your best, you're going to reflect all fruit of the Spirit, right? Love, joy, peace, patience. Like you're going to reflect all of this. This is what I'm calling you up to, not, you know, some of this places where our society is saying, hey, you're going to find fulfillment there. And it's like the lowest form of my functioning to go there. So it'll be, sometimes you have to get everything you want to recognize that's not what I wanted.
Exactly.
Right? Like I got it all and I didn't, it's not that great.
Yeah, I've seen that. There's a lot of, there's a big move with, you know, the trans movement, but there's also like this unspoken movement more and more. We see a lot of people saying they're detransitioning, I guess they call it. And a lot of people are like, I just, you know, they're coming out of this swirl of a mindset. And it was like a certain mind frame they were in, and they were just like, I just felt like I was this, but then all of a sudden it's interesting to watch interviews where they're now saying they're coming out of that and they feel corrected to their actual born birth gender. So it's really interesting to see both sides, like, oh, I feel like this, but then you see people coming out saying, you know, I used to feel that way, you know, and so I think God is definitely doing something, and with Gen Z, and you can see it with Asbury Revival, where again it started off with, I think, a kid sharing like what he struggled with, and he's just being vulnerable on the stage, and then like another, you know, another teenager or whatever, or student came up and shared with their struggles, and it just turned into like this whole confession thing, and then like it just never stopped. It just kind of kept rolling. And so I don't know.
And that's the truth telling, kind of going all the way back to the people that said, come in our home and take the armor off and just be you. There's something, whether it's counseling or, you know, friendship or whatever, real connection happens when you're honest. It's just, and the Asbury thing, from what I understand too, is the kids were just honest. This is what I'm dealing with. This is what I struggle with. And it broke something where people were like, fine, you know, and just somehow ushered in the Spirit of God to say, I'm here. This is where I want you to be. I'm present. Like, I'm loving it. I'm here for it. You know, you be honest and let me show up with you as you are, who you are. And show you what I'm like, and he isn't like us. And that's the hard part, is we reject each other, and we exploit each other, and we treat each other like garbage, and we do really, really rotten things. And so we learn, I have to guard and protect and show up, you know, create a false persona or whatever. But when the Holy Spirit comes, whether it's Jesus movement or what your aunt's saying, I would love to find that on YouTube.
I'll send it to you.
You gotta find that, and that needs to be posted. But just his presence to say, you, as you are, I see you, and you're just accepted and loved right where you are for who you are, and I'm not asking for more. I don't need anything from you. He's not needy. You know, like people, I need you to be something, right? You know, I might not mean to, but because I'm broken or weak, I might need you to be something. He doesn't need you to be anything. And, you know, I think it's hard for us to let that kind of love happen and be that honest. And, but I think that's, and ultimately, I think mental health is always moving toward that, right? Like trying to get people whole and feeling sound and accepted and like complete. But really, we can offer some of it to each other. We can try to work on it for ourselves, but it's really in God's presence that we experience that wholeness. Anyway.
No, I agree. There's something about just being vulnerable. That's kind of what I always wanted in everything that I did, was always to exude the love of God, but also to be honest and real. I feel like that's what people can identify with. Even like when I think of Keith Green, I always felt like he was a real artist. You know, like, and that's why people loved him, and also sometimes some people hated him in the church because he was real. And some of his stuff felt like kind of dark, but then when I read some of the Psalms, like, I felt like David had moments where things went pretty dark for him. And it was rough when he was being chased, and, you know, he had to hide out in caves, and, you know, he was like, oh, my bones are like they're crushed to dust, and, you know, all this stuff. But yet will I praise, oh God, you know. And so.
And how do you go from being told you're going to be anointed, you're the anointed king, to that's, no one saw that story coming, right? Yeah. And so how would you not have a ton of doubts and questions and feel really lost?
Yeah.
When you thought, I know what direction I'm going in. Yeah. And then you're way over here. Yeah, that's not easy.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I read one of the Psalms I read recently during Holy Week. I think he was talking about being betrayed by his friend. And that was tough. You know, it's like the one that I worshiped together with in his temple, I think he was saying. And it's like, wow, you know, I never thought that.
You'd be the one.
Yeah, so it's like, how do you continue? But yet, David would just find a way to break through with his worship. And I just thought, that's fascinating. That's powerful. He never gave up. He also did a lot of prophesying. He would, Bill would always say that David was a man who would call what was meant for the future into his present. By declaring in praise and worship, he would declare what he saw. In a lot of aspects, I think they kept putting the Psalms in the Holy Week too, because David also prophesied a lot about, you know, the coming Messiah. I don't even know if he realized he was doing it, because the way he's saying it doesn't seem like he realizes what he's doing, but he is totally prophesying the coming of Messiah after him. And so, maybe I think that's why they added it to the Holy Week devotions. They always added one psalm, and it was something that David was declaring about Messiah Yeshua before he even came. Like,
isn't that crazy?
He wasn't even born yet, you know.
Isn't it crazy?
Yeah.
It's just so crazy when you put it. I've enjoyed the Bible Project. I don't know if you.
Oh yeah, I just started getting into.
They're always doing that, you know, kind of drawing those lines. They always call it hyperlinks, but like these lines between what was said or done in the Old Testament and how it's fulfilled, or
the parallel.
And it is just so crazy to think about the thousands of years apart. That those things happened, and that for God putting that all, it's so complex. And just putting that all together, he's like, no, I got it. So I'm going to do it. It's just so.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it's just crazy.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on to the show. And it's always a pleasure to have you here. I love having you here because, I don't know, we just end up going to incredible places, going deep. So if you don't mind, I would love for you to come back.
Thank you.
People love you too. I've had so many people come up to me at different church services and be like, hey, I love this show. And then they're like, my favorite's Kathleen. So nice. I was like, we got to get her back on. And because I think we're the wisdom and the spiritual wisdom and knowledge that you carry, even through your degree and all that stuff, I just feel like you're able to speak on certain topics very well versed because of your experience with it, you know. Thanks. So I think it's always really fun having you here. That's so sweet. I
made a lot of mistakes too. That's how I learned. That's how I know some stuff.
We all do too. Somebody was asking me about dating the other day, and I said, "Oh man, I can tell you some stories, man. You know, we just experiences.
I can tell you what not to do.
Yeah, I can tell you what not to do in Jesus' name, brother." So you know, I totally get it. It's like when you've like lived a certain life and you like learn by not just studying but applying, or letting yourself explore and like make those mistakes, and then like God comes in and is like, it's okay, you know, like he lifts us up, you know.
I love it.
Encourages us. So it's great to have you back on. But
thank you. I hope this continues to go really well for you.
Yes.
It's really fun to watch.
Yeah. This is awesome. Yeah.
I love it.
But we love having you on, and I appreciate you coming again.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bless you.
You too.